I'm Tessa Bilecki,
And I'm David Denny.
and this is Fire and Light,
Life.
Love,
Soul.
Soul. This is our first episode. So in this episode, we're going to tell you, why are we calling this Fire and Light?
And we'll also look at some questions that you may have about spirituality, about contemplation.
And we're going to tell you who we are. Some of you know who we are already, but many of you don't.
And then toward the end of each episode, we'll suggest a spiritual practice that we could all do together.
And at the very end, we'll quiet down and we'll do a meditation with you. Why are we calling this podcast Fire and Light?
Well, we used to teach a class at Colorado College called Fire and Light. It was a history of Christian mysticism or contemplation. And one of the quotations I like to give to the students came from St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a monk in the Middle Ages. And he said, the Holy Spirit gives light so that we may understand, and fire so that we may love. And those are the two poles that we like to look at, the fire of love and the light of knowledge.
And I love how Hildegard of Bingen, another mystic who actually knew St. Bernard, she talked about an experience that she had. She was sitting at her desk, and it seemed to her as if the heavens opened up and a fiery light flashed. And I love how she says fiery light, because there she is combining both fire and light. And it filled her whole mind, which is the light part, and it inflamed her heart, which is the fire part. And she said it wasn't like a burning so much, but like a warming flame, the way the sun's rays warm everything that they touch.
So we've talked about Bernard and Hildegard. We refer to them as mystics, but who are the mystics? What are they? What's that mean anyway?
I think the best way I want to answer that is by saying they're my friends. They're role models for us, the men and women of wisdom who have gone before us, who have kind of gone out to the edge, come back, told us what they've learned. And there are tremendous lessons to be gleaned from the lives of the men and women mystics. So from time to time, we'll be talking about our favorite mystics.
So they're not just kind of weird people who had strange, bizarre experiences?
No. Mysticism, I guess some people think it's a spooky phenomenon. I used to never use the word mysticism, never use the adjective mystical. I preferred to say contemplative. Those are interchangeable words. And mysticism is really ordinary, day-to-day experience of the sacred or the divine in our lives. It's that simple. And we love to say that the mystic is not a special kind of person, but everyone is or has the capacity for being a special kind of mystic. So, Dave, you're not going to be another St. Bernard. I'm not going to be another St. Hildegard. I have to be a mystic in my way. You have to be a mystic in your way. And everybody out there listening to us needs to be a mystic in his or her own way. This is really, really important.
It sounds like it might be a lot more down to earth than what some people think. In fact, we call our podcast Fire and Light, Life, Love, and Soul. So those are pretty down to earth, concrete things, right?
Yeah, we're emphasizing life.
So I'm glad of that, because it seems to me that one of the most important things I've found out about in Christianity is that it really is about vitality. It's about life, that Christ, God, brings people into more and more life. And I think sometimes people have the idea that we're monks or mystics aren't very lively people. And that's not been my experience.
Yeah, it's not my experience either. And I hope that's what people really pick up from what we're going to be sharing. I love that we're using the word soul, and not in any kind of a technical way. What we mean when we say soul is simply the deepest part of ourselves. What makes us who we are? That's our soul.
And then, of course, love is at the heart of all of this. And some of the questions I think that come up when people talk about living a life of virtue or a life of love, a vital life, is that how do we keep love alive? Sometimes it can fizzle out in some people's relationships. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think in addition to asking in this podcast, how do we light up our lives? What brings light to our lives? What sets our hearts on fire? I think we want to ask, how do we keep love alive? And how do we celebrate everyone in the great circle of life?
I like how you mentioned everyone, because it seems to me that a lot of religious type people are characterized as being sort of clannish or, group oriented. And so they're nice to each other, but they don't like people from other groups.
Yeah. And one of our big characteristics is that we stand rooted in the Christian tradition, but we are open to all the other traditions. We are actually interspiritual, the term that some people use, or interreligious. We've spent a lot of our lives doing interreligious dialogue, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. One of the other questions that we want to be dealing with in this podcast is, how can we be deeply engaged in the suffering world? And the world is definitely suffering as well as full of joy. So how can we be deeply engaged in that suffering world and yet live sanely and contemplatively?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think sometimes people have the idea that the mystic is involved in something that's beyond time and space, and it's kind of ethereal and has nothing to do with this world. But
yeah,
so we don't want to fall into that trap.
No,
there's a strong prophetic tradition, like in Christianity and in Judaism, that is very engaged. And so it's tricky because there's a lot of suffering in the world. And yet, part of what we want to try to do is bring stories of hope, because it seems to me that no matter how dark things ever get in history, there's something that, and Christians call it salvation history, there's always some kind of seed of hope that allows some light to break through in the midst of the darkness.
And a lot of joy, and we'll be talking about stories of joy as well. And Dave, I really love how you're especially good at ferreting out from the news the stories that aren't told large enough, loudly enough, stories of hope and stories of joy. So we'll also be focusing on that. Now, who are we? I'm Tessa Bilecki. You could go on my website, tessabilecki.com, and get a lot more details. Let me say simply and succinctly that I call myself a contemplative. That means my relationship with God is most important to me. And you will hear us using God language. We have to be true to our own experience. Some of you out there don't use God language. So all you have to do is translate how you would understand what we mean by God. Could be the sacred, could be the divine, could be the universe, could be the Great Mother. A friend of mine whose book I just read refers to this as the Tao. So whatever language you use is appropriate, and keep that in mind whenever you hear something and our lingo or the language we use isn't what you would use. You just translate it into the language that you would use. So I'm also a writer. I've done several books on Saint Teresa of Avila, my favorite mystic, actually my favorite person, besides Dave, of course. And Dave and I together have done a book on Christmas and also one on the desert from various perspectives, including the inner desert of loss and grief and facing death. And I also call myself a teacher because I go out to give retreats and lectures and teachings, and of course, in these past years, have been doing a lot on Zoom. I also call myself an urban hermit, and that can sound spooky too. Basically, it means that I live alone, I choose to live alone, and that solitude, which I believe is our birthright as human beings, and over the next months, I'm going to be talking more positively about solitude for everyone as a spiritual practice. So I lived in a monastic community of hermits, and now I am alone in an apartment in Tucson, Arizona. As I age, I felt like I needed to be closer to healthcare. And also, after almost 50 years in the wilderness, I really thought it was time for me to get a little more culture.
Sounds like a good idea. And as it happens, we're next floor neighbors, is what we call each other, because I live in an apartment right down below yours. So we have the advantages of the solitude, the quiet, but also the friendship and the community that goes with that. So maybe I should say a bit about who I am. I jokingly call myself priest, poet, and desert rat.
Yeah, I love that desert rat. I'm a desert rat too, but you got the moniker.
So I am a Roman Catholic priest, and I was in monastery with Tessa for 30 years. So much of my formation was in the wilderness as well. And then we left the monastery and started this desert foundation that's a big part of our lives. And here I am today living in Tucson, Arizona. I might want to say a little bit about what formed me earlier in my life. I was an exchange student when I was in high school in Afghanistan, and that opened me up to the world of Islam, the world of the Middle East, the world of Jewish history as well. So that really marked me before I ever got to the monastery. And I was interested in dialogue between religions right from the beginning. And thank goodness our monastery really promoted and encouraged that kind of interest. So although I've kind of fallen in love with Christ, that to me is not something that excludes everything else, but opens the door to dialogue and learning from other traditions. So those are some of the main themes from my life.
And the Desert Foundation, how would you describe that?
The Desert Foundation is a circle of friends, a kind of informal group who are people interested in how the desert affects our inner life, the physical desert, but also we talk about the grief, the loss that we all go through in life at some point, that is a kind of desert experience as well. And although it's very painful, it can also be very transformative. So that's part of what we talk about. And then we are also very interested, as I mentioned, my own biography, having some contact with Judaism and Islam. We are very interested in opening doors of dialogue and understanding between Jews and Christians and Muslims.
Those are all the traditions that grew out of the desert,
That's right.
Which is partly why we're focusing on them.
Right. So the desert isn't just that we happen to live in Tucson, Arizona, but it also is the place where the first Christian monasteries cropped up in North Africa and the Middle East. And so that landscape had a big formative influence. And of course, the Jews in the desert when they left Egypt, and we can talk about that some other time.
And also, you relate the desert to injustice, justice and injustice.
Yep, that's another thing I've tried to focus on. This is not something that people just choose. You go out into the desert to pray. Sometimes injustices are foisted on us. And how do we deal with that? And to me, I think this is a really powerful part of the desert tradition. How can we deal with things such as prejudice, exclusion, and how do we keep that from grinding us down and threatening our human dignity?
And on the Desert Foundation website, Sand and Sky, I think you really zero in on the desert of injustice, which I really admire. I personally don't write so much about that. On my website, you'll find more about the physical desert and more about our relationship with the divine. But Dave is much more focused on what are the injustices that we see in our world today, and again, what are the stories of hope in the face of those injustices. I said I described myself as a contemplative, that we're all called to be contemplatives. We're all called to this love affair with the divine. And over the years, my almost 40 years and Dave's almost 30 years in the monastery, we learned a lot about concrete practices for fostering this life of love with the divine. And we continue that. Part of what is so fascinating to me about now living in an apartment in Tucson is that the life I'm living, the practices I engage in are the same as they always were, both in monastic community and in those 15 years out of the monastery and in a really solitary hermitage out in the middle of nowhere in Colorado. These concrete practices we're going to be sharing with you one each time.
So today, what is the practice that you're going to look at today? And we might want to say a little bit more, why do we need these practices? What's wrong with our lives that we would need these practices?
Well, our monasteries were not only where we lived as monks, but they were also retreat centers. So people from all walks of life, hundreds and hundreds of people, men and women, people who were rooted in Christianity, lots of Buddhists, lots of people who weren't affiliated with any tradition at all would come. And there was a very rich exchange between those of us who were monks, and the people who came. And I think people don't understand that the same problems or difficulties that people face, let's say, out in the world as they try to live a more contemplative life, are the same ones that we faced in the monastery, because difficulties most fundamentally are within the human heart. And of course, all of us have hearts. So we would all be struggling with the same things. So over the years, we just, out of all of this dialogue with all of these people from different traditions, different walks of life, different ages, different occupations, we came up with a whole series of concrete ways of living daily life that keep us more sane, help us to be more contemplative. Today, we'd like to look at what I think is most fundamental, the first place to start. And the way I describe that is that we need to live more naturally, or we need to live in tune with the rhythms of nature. When St. Teresa in her monasteries, she would have women in her convents that suffered from, they actually used the word melancholy, and that covered everything from full-blown psychosis to just plain old nervousness and the neuroses that we all suffer from. And somewhere in her writing, she talked about what we need when we're suffering from melancholy is, first of all, if you came to her and told her that you were struggling, she said, first, you should eat red meat. Secondly, if that didn't work, red wine. Third, if that didn't work, a bop on the head. And Thomas, and now that sounds crazy maybe, but I'll explain in a minute. And Thomas Aquinas there's another great story about him. When someone came to him and said, I'm having difficulty praying, I'm having difficulty meditating, I'm having difficulty in my relationship with God. And Thomas Aquinas said, well, why don't you take a bath? And I love both of these stories because what they illustrate is that very often our difficulties are not spiritual, and I'm making quotation marks here. Our difficulties are really quite natural. They're just part of the ebb and flow of ordinary life.
It's interesting that you're saying all that, because I think a lot of times we have the impression that mystics are supernatural, which often we tend to translate into unnatural.
Yeah. I love a fundamental teaching from Thomas Aquinas was grace perfects nature. So that supernatural doesn't mean something different from the natural life. It means the grace of God blessing what is already good and natural in our lives. So we cannot dissociate our so-called spiritual lives from our natural lives. That's where we begin. So I think the first step is to live an honest to goodness, matter of fact, down to earth, natural life. And we need to touch the earth quite literally. That means it helps to grow a garden. And if we don't have the space, which I no longer have, I can at least grow plants out on my patio. It means to work with our hands, to do whatever kind of, as much manual labor as we possibly can. Arts and crafts. We are embodied creatures. We need to do things with our body. We need to live close to animals. Our roots lie in nature. We're part of it. We're created from it, out of the dust of the earth, the Jewish scriptures tell us. And one day we're going to go back to it. So if we lose touch with our roots in the earth, we wither and die.
You sound like Shakespeare. I think he said that a touch of nature. What did he say about the touch of nature?
A touch of nature makes the whole world kin.
That's what it is.
Yeah. And I love how, I think that's from Troilus and Cressida, which I've never read, but I love this quote. And makes the whole world kin. That means we are in relationship with all of it. So we need to get to know our natural environment. I'm always surprised at how many people don't know the names of the trees and the wildflowers in their neighborhoods. If the whole world is kin, you know the names of your kin. So I think it's important to know the names of the trees and flowers that grow in our environment as much as it is to know the names of our aunts and uncles and cousins.
You even have a star chart, don't you?
Yeah. We need to know the names of the constellations in the sky. The constellations, the stars are our friends. For me, my favorite constellation is Orion. Maybe because he's so big. I everywhere I've lived, and I've lived in many different environments, lived in the desert, lived in the woods and lakes of Nova Scotia, the mountains of Colorado, the green fields of Ireland, all these different environments that I came to know. And the constants in all of those countries, all of those different environments were the stars, and especially Orion. So that wherever I travel, I remember the thrill of watching Orion rise over the skyscrapers in New York City. Whenever I see Orion, I feel at home. So get yourself something that puts that where you can learn what the constellations in the sky are, and at different times of the year, because Orion is only a fall winter constellation, and when he leaves in the springtime, I always feel this sorrow. I actually say goodbye, and then it's always a thrill. It's usually at the end of August, as the seasons are changing. Orion comes back, and I find myself saying hello again. Oh, you're back. I'm so glad to see you. So, staying in tune with the rhythms of nature is important, with summer, fall, winter, spring, daytime, nighttime,
Moonrise.
sunrise. We need to live in harmony with the sun and the moon. I'm always surprised at how people go about their ordinary business on the night of the full moon, for example.
Yeah, we were lucky when we lived in the wilderness. We could just walk out of our hermitages and look up into Nova Scotia sky. It was iffy because it was always so cloudy, but Colorado was almost always crystal clear, and it was so easy. Now I have to go out into the parking lot, and I have to block out all the unnatural artificial light to see the moon, but at least that's one of the ways I connect again during the day in the city, is get up early enough to catch the moon in the morning, or stay up late enough at night to catch the moon.
Yeah, sometimes we even have to get in the car and drive a little farther out into the desert.
Just to see the rise.
Yeah, just to see the rise, the full moon rise over the Santa Catalinas here in Tucson. So that's the practice that we're challenging you with this first podcast. Live more naturally, live more in tune with the rhythms of the earth, which means getting to know your natural environment, learning the names of the trees, the plants, the wildflowers around you, the names of the constellations, paying attention to the rhythms of the sun and moon. And it helps if you can't do all this from where you live. Now, I even managed to do it from the balcony of my urban apartment. But if you can't do it from where you live, then find one sacred spot close by where you live and go to that same place at different seasons of the year, at different times of the day, in the sunlight, in the rainfall, in the snowfall, if you're lucky enough to have snow, or not so lucky. And learn what you can learn, not only about nature, but about yourself in relationship to this very special sacred place.
So you talked about sacred places. It seems to me there's also sacred times, and we're moving into the new year now. And these are practices then we hope to employ in the new year. And one of the practices, or one of the understandings that I've found helpful when talking about the new year, is looking forward not just to managing my time, like clock time, well, but also looking for those moments of what we might call kairos, which is it's a Greek word for time. It's different from chronos. Chronos is like clock time. Kairos is timeless time, or what some of the mystics call the eternal now. And you might know what that is. I'm sure you know what that is. It's when you're swept up in music or dance and you lose track of time and you think a moment has gone by and maybe it's been an hour. Those are those sacred moments where you're off the clock and you are deeply, deeply immersed in something very mysterious and meaningful. And that's really important, it seems to me.
Yeah, and that's my New Year's blog is about Kairos and Chronos, about fast and feast, or about what someone described as festal times and ferial times. I love that word ferial, which actually means ordinary time. And this is part of the genius of the um, Roman Catholic liturgical year. We have our feast days and then we have our ferial days, or what we call ordinary time. And a great read. One of the first things I read as a young monk was a book called Supper of the Lamb. And the author of that book, he was both a theologian and a great cook.
Nice combo.
Yeah. It was a fascinating book that was full of theology, the theology of food, the theology of the body, the theology of the earth, as well as a bunch of recipes. And he described this rhythm of feast days and ordinary days. And he used this term. So what he said was, we need to keep the feast days because there are great, towering, special moments in life, but we should never forget the ferial days or the ordinary days because, first of all, life without great occasions is not worth living, but we cannot neglect the glory of what he called grand ordinariness. Grand ordinariness. That phrase has stuck with me for the last 50 years. It's something I knew intuitively, but I didn't have words for it. And he gave me that phrase, grand ordinariness. So if you go to tessabalecki.com, not only can you read a little bit more about this, but then I also give you a beautiful blessing of calendars that we can do at the beginning of every new year, and also special prayers to say that kind of sanctify the 365 days of the coming year.
So now we wanted to mention that another thing we want to do each time we get together is we'd like to lead a little meditation toward the end of each podcast. So today, Tessa, you were talking about your meditation on the new year on your website, but we'd like to offer a Celtic blessing of the new year together. And we'll read that to you in a moment, but to get ready, the monastery, we talked about proximate preparation for prayer and meditation, which means has to do with your posture. Sit in a posture that's comfortable for you, but also alert. So that usually means keeping your back kind of straight and in a position in which you can breathe deeply and easily. So take a moment to settle your body that way and take a couple of deep breaths. Then allow yourself to go off the clock, and you can let go of many of the questions or problems that have been on your mind and heart today. They'll be there when you come back. So allow yourself to take a break and enter into the present moment where you're undistracted, and take a breath.
May you find truth in the year's smallest grace, and hope in the year's most heavy cross.
May the pillar of light before your face drive off the darkness so you're never lost.
May your journey be safe where'er you go, and angels protect you from hassle and fuss.
May you learn to walk a little bit slow and to grow each day in hope and in trust.
And may the God of new beginnings grant you a new year of love and peace.
Amen.
Amen. Happy New Year, everyone.
Thank you for listening.
And be with us for our next podcast in February. February is a great month. It's the beginning of the Celtic New Year. It's also the Feast of Candlemas, and there's a great tradition, in the Christian tradition anyway, of blessing candles on this day. It's also the Feast of the Presentation, which happens to be Dave's monastic name. He's David of the Presentation, so he'll have something really interesting on the Sand and Sky website about that, and I'll be doing a Candlemas blessing that you can incorporate into your lives.
And February is Black History Month. And as we mentioned earlier, part of what we like to talk about in terms of the desert is injustice. And I have some meditations and reflections on a trilogy. It's actually a graphic novel about the life of the late John Lewis. Powerful way to talk about the desert of injustice through the way he lived his life.
So join us next month for Fire and Light, and check out our websites, tessabalecki.com
and sandandsky.org.
The background music for Fire and Light is The Day We Met, composed and performed by Ricky Zhao.
Fire and Light's theme music is Dreamcatcher, composed and performed by Chris Martin and Jeff Harvey at Purple Planet Music.
Fire and Light is recorded in Tucson, Arizona, editing by David Levin.